Khutulun was born into one of the most powerful families in the world, yet her name is not one that is instantly recognized by most people today. She was a Mongol princess, the daughter of Kaidu, a cousin of Kublai Khan, and a member of the illustrious Borjigin clan that produced some of the most famous figures in history, including her great-grandfather, Genghis Khan. Her story, however, is not one of a passive royal living in the shadows of her more famous ancestors. Instead, it is a tale of a woman who, from an early age, stood apart not only for her royal lineage, but for her extraordinary prowess as a warrior, strategist, and ruler in a society that was traditionally patriarchal. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire was a vast, interconnected network of territories spanning Asia and Europe, forged through the conquests of Genghis Khan and his descendants. By the time of Khutulun's birth, much of this empire had fractured, and the Mongol world was divided into several competing khanates, each vying for power and influence. One of these khanates was the Chagatai Khanate, the region where Khutulun grew up. It was a turbulent time, with internal divisions and external threats constantly testing the resolve of the Mongol leaders. It was against this backdrop that Khutulun's story unfolded. She was raised amidst the tumult of Mongol politics, where power was often determined by military prowess. From a young age, Khutulun was not only exposed to the traditional roles reserved for women of noble birth, managing household affairs, overseeing servants, and participating in ceremonial duties, but was also encouraged by her father to train as a warrior. In Mongol society, physical strength and combat skills were highly valued, especially among the aristocracy, who needed to defend their territories and maintain their influence. Khutulun, however, took this to an extraordinary level. She is said to have been a formidable fighter, excelling in horse riding, archery, and hand-to-hand combat. Her remarkable skill in wrestling was legendary. She was known to wrestle and defeat some of the most seasoned warriors in her father's army. Her physical prowess alone was enough to make her a rare figure among her contemporaries, and the stories of her victories spread far and wide. Her training did not just involve combat, but also the cultivation of political acumen. The Mongol world, like any empire, was not solely shaped by the battlefield. Strategy, diplomacy, and alliances were equally important in maintaining power. Khutulun's family was embroiled in ongoing disputes with other Mongol factions, particularly with Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty. These internal rivalries shaped Khutulun's worldview, and it became apparent that, like many Mongol leaders, she would need to master both military strategy and political maneuvering to secure her family's position. She was not a figurehead, nor was she content with passive involvement in her father's ambitions. Instead, she took an active role in the military and political life of her people, commanding troops, forging alliances, and engaging in both diplomatic and military confrontations. As a young woman, Khutulun was often described as an unusual presence in her father's court, one who could command attention not only for her fighting ability, but for her presence in the political sphere. It was said that Kaidu, her father, relied on her counsel and judgment in matters of war and governance. She had a reputation for being a shrewd strategist, able to read both the battlefield and the political landscape with exceptional clarity. Her involvement in military campaigns, particularly in the wars between the Chagatai Khanate and the Yuan dynasty, showcased her ability to blend military force with tactical intelligence. She proved that she was a leader in her own right, not just a princess who happened to be the daughter of a powerful ruler. However, Khutulun's story is not simply one of military victories. In the Mongol world, power was not easily secured or maintained. Family loyalty was crucial, and betrayal was not uncommon. Her father's wars with Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty were not just territorial disputes, but personal rivalries. In this context, Khutulun had to navigate not just external threats, but also the complex dynamics within her own family and tribe. Her role as a leader was further complicated by her gender. In a time and culture where leadership and power were often defined by male authority, Khutulun's rise to prominence was remarkable for the very fact that she did so in a predominantly male-dominated world. Her most significant challenge, however, may have come in the form of her own marriage prospects. In a society where political alliances were often sealed through marriage, Khutulun's refusal to marry and her insistence on maintaining her independence was a bold statement. Stories of her demanding that any suitor who wished to marry her must defeat her in a wrestling match became famous. No man, it is said, ever succeeded in this challenge, and Khutulun remained unmarried throughout her life. This defiance of traditional gender expectations made her a figure of both admiration and suspicion. To many, she was a symbol of Mongol strength and honor. To others, she represented a threat to the traditional social order. Despite the challenges and resistance she faced, Khutulun's influence continued to grow. As her father's power waned, she assumed a larger role in the administration of the Chagatai Khanate. She took command of armies and personally led them into battle, continuing the military campaigns her father had initiated. Her military successes were not only a testament to her physical prowess, but also to her ability to unite diverse factions under her leadership. Her soldiers respected her not just for her skill in battle, but for her strategic mind, and she became known for leading her troops with the same tenacity and courage that she had demonstrated in her earlier years. Her legacy, however, is complicated. While she is often remembered for her military victories and leadership, it is clear that her success came at a cost. The Chagatai Khanate, like many Mongol territories, was plagued by internal strife, and Khutulun's efforts to maintain her father's legacy were undermined by shifting allegiances and the changing tides of Mongol politics. Eventually, Khutulun's political influence waned, and the once great Khanate began to crumble. Despite her valiant efforts, the political and military environment in which she operated was increasingly difficult to navigate. Yet Khutulun's story endures. Her legacy lives on in the historical record, not just as a warrior princess, but as a woman who defied the expectations of her time. In a world where women were often relegated to the background, Khutulun carved out a space for herself in the annals of history. She proved that power could be wielded by anyone, regardless of gender, and that strength came not just from a sword but from the mind and will to lead. Khutulun's life challenges many of the traditional narratives about women in history. Her story is not one of passive suffering or subjugation, but one of active agency, strength, and leadership. She is a testament to the fact that history is often shaped by those who dare to break the mold, and her tale continues to inspire those who seek to understand the complexities of power, identity, and legacy in a world that is constantly changing. The story of Khutulun is a reminder that history is made by those who refuse to be confined by the roles others try to impose upon them. Khutulun's rise to prominence was not solely the result of her martial abilities, but also the product of her unique position within the intricate web of Mongol politics. As a daughter of Kaidu, the ruler of the Chagatai Khanate, she was born into a world of political intrigue, shifting alliances, and brutal warfare. The Mongol Empire, at its height, was an unstoppable force, with a reach that extended from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. Yet, by the time Khutulun came of age, the once unified Mongol Empire had fractured into several competing khanates. The tension between these factions defined much of her life, and it was this complex backdrop that shaped her actions and ambitions. From an early age, Khutulun's life was marked by a sharp awareness of the fragility of power. Her father, Kaidu, ruled over the Chagatai Khanate, one of the four major divisions of the Mongol Empire. This region was a crucial part of the Mongol world, strategically located between the territories of Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty in the east and the rising powers of the Persian and Russian realms in the west. Kaidu was a fierce and capable leader, but he was embroiled in a long-standing struggle for dominance with Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, who had established the Yuan dynasty in China. The rivalry between Kaidu and Kublai was more than a simple clash of empires. It was a deeply personal conflict, rooted in their shared bloodline and differing visions for the future of the Mongol world. Khutulun, being both the daughter of Kaidu and a member of the Borjigin clan, was acutely aware of the significance of this power struggle. Her father was determined to maintain the autonomy of the Chagatai Khanate and assert his authority over the Mongol world, even as Kublai Khan sought to expand his influence. The struggle between these two cousins would dominate much of Khutulun's early life and shape her understanding of power, loyalty, and the costs of war. While many of the Mongol aristocracy, particularly the women, were confined to the domestic sphere, Khutulun's role was far from conventional. In the traditional Mongol view, strength was paramount, and leadership was often earned through military success. This was a world where women could sometimes wield power, albeit in unusual forms. Khutulun's upbringing reflected these norms. Her father, Kaidu, did not see his daughter's gender as an obstacle to her future. Instead, he recognized her exceptional qualities as a warrior and a leader. While other noble women in the Mongol courts were primarily concerned with managing household affairs, Khutulun was trained in the arts of war. She learned to ride horses, shoot arrows, and fight with both swords and spears. It is said that she surpassed many of the men in her father's army, earning respect as a formidable fighter and gaining a reputation for her strength and determination. This unique upbringing set Khutulun apart from other women of her time. While other women might have been married off to secure political alliances or kept behind the scenes as caretakers of family affairs, Khutulun was encouraged to develop her combat skills and play an active role in her father's military campaigns. Kaidu, for all his fierce warrior nature, saw in Khutulun a potential that extended beyond mere loyalty to family. He saw her as a valuable asset in his ongoing war against Kublai Khan. Khutulun's training was not limited to physical combat. She also developed a keen sense of strategy, a skill that would prove essential in the later stages of her life. The Mongol army was unlike many of its contemporaries. It was composed of highly mobile cavalry units that relied on speed, surprise, and precision. The Mongols were skilled at using the terrain to their advantage and employing unconventional tactics to confuse and overwhelm their enemies. These methods of warfare were deeply ingrained in Khutulun's upbringing, and she became an expert in these techniques, often accompanying her father on military expeditions. Her participation in her father's military campaigns was not just a matter of personal interest, but a demonstration of her importance to his political and military strategy. Kaidu's wars against Kublai Khan were not just military engagements. They were part of a larger struggle for control of the Mongol world. The political ramifications of these conflicts were immense, as the outcome of each battle had the potential to alter the balance of power in the entire empire. Kaidu relied heavily on his daughter's leadership abilities, and Khutulun, in turn, became increasingly involved in the military decision-making process. She not only fought on the battlefield, but also helped plan the strategies that would shape the course of the war. While Khutulun's contributions to her father's military efforts were significant, her role in the political landscape was equally important. The Mongol Empire, despite its military might, was often a fragile structure, held together by alliances and family ties. Kaidu's struggle against Kublai Khan was not just a matter of personal rivalry, but a deeply political conflict. The outcome of this struggle had the potential to reshape the future of the Mongol Empire, and Khutulun's involvement in this struggle was essential to her family's survival. One of the key elements of Khutulun's political and military role was her ability to maintain alliances with other Mongol factions. Mongol politics were often determined by shifting alliances and betrayals, and Khutulun was adept at navigating this complex landscape. While her father was a powerful leader, he was not invulnerable. He had to rely on alliances with other Mongol rulers to maintain his strength and ensure the survival of the Chagatai Khanate. Khutulun, as her father's chief advisor and military leader, played a pivotal role in managing these alliances, ensuring that her father's interests were protected and that his enemies were kept at bay. At the heart of Khutulun's story, however, was the ongoing rivalry between her father and Kublai Khan. This conflict was not simply about military might. It was about competing visions of what the Mongol world should look like. Kublai Khan, who had established the Yuan dynasty in China, sought to consolidate his power and expand his influence across the Mongol Empire. Kaidu, on the other hand, rejected Kublai's authority, and sought to maintain the traditional Mongol way of life. He saw himself as the true heir of Genghis Khan's legacy, and he believed that Kublai's approach to ruling the empire was misguided. Khutulun's personal involvement in this struggle was not just a matter of family loyalty. It was also a matter of her own vision for the future of the Mongol world. She believed in her father's vision and supported his resistance to Kublai Khan's rule. Her role in the conflict between Kaidu and Kublai was not just one of passive support, but active participation. She fought in numerous battles and campaigns, often alongside her father, and her skill as a warrior earned her the respect of the men under her command. Her leadership on the battlefield became legendary, and she was known for her courage and strategic brilliance. In the end, Khutulun's involvement in the power struggles of the Mongol world was a reflection of the complex nature of Mongol politics and warfare. Her contributions to her father's military and political efforts were indispensable, and her role as a warrior and leader helped define the course of the Chagatai Khanate during a critical period in its history. But Khutulun's influence extended beyond the battlefield and the court. Her story is one of resilience, determination, and an unwavering commitment to her family's legacy. She remains one of the most fascinating figures of Mongol history, a woman who rose to power in a world dominated by men and carved out her place in the annals of history as a warrior princess, a strategist, and a leader. Khutulun's life, shaped by the sweeping tides of Mongol history and the fracturing of an empire once united under her great-grandfather, Genghis Khan, reveals a striking narrative of resistance, identity, and power. Her extraordinary talents were not simply an anomaly of circumstance, but a result of the complex pressures of her upbringing. As the daughter of Kaidu, ruler of the Chagatai Khanate, and a cousin of Kublai Khan, the founder of the Yuan dynasty in China, Khutulun lived in the heart of Mongol conflict. Her life unfolded against a backdrop of dynastic struggles, territorial expansion, and shifting political allegiances that were as turbulent as they were consequential. The Mongol world at this time was fragmented and divided into separate khanates, each vying for dominance. And it was here, amidst the complex web of rivalries, that Khutulun would come into her own. The Mongol Empire, though once unified under the strategic genius of Genghis Khan, had splintered into various regions ruled by his descendants, each with different goals, ideologies, and ambitions. The empire's geographic division became both its strength and its vulnerability. For Khutulun, this meant that her family, the Chagatai Khanate, was constantly in a state of war with other Mongol factions, particularly with Kublai Khan, who ruled the Yuan dynasty. These wars, however, were not merely political. They were intensely personal. The rivalries among the descendants of Genghis Khan carried with them the weight of legacy, pride, and a vision of how the Mongol world should be governed. From a young age, Khutulun understood that her role was not one of mere bystander or passive princess. While many women in the Mongol courts were relegated to the domestic sphere, tasked with overseeing family matters or making strategic marriages, Khutulun was groomed to be a warrior and leader. Her father, Kaidu, had no intention of following the traditional Mongol gender roles that often confined women to secondary positions. Instead, he encouraged her to train as a fighter, as a strategist, and as an equal to her male counterparts. This rare opportunity to engage in warfare was not just a matter of personal interest. It was vital for her to fully understand the nature of the world she was inheriting and to prove herself as a leader in her own right. Khutulun's training was rigorous. She became a skilled horse rider, an expert archer, and a formidable wrestler. Her skills were not merely ornamental. They were essential to the survival and prosperity of the Chagatai Khanate. As a young woman, Khutulun participated in the same military campaigns as her father, and her role was as active as that of any general. The Mongol military machine was infamous for its discipline, organization, and use of innovative tactics. The ability to think strategically was as important as strength in battle, and Khutulun excelled in both. She was known for her brilliance in warfare, where she combined her physical prowess with a sharp, strategic mind. As a result, Her name became well known not only within her own clan, but also among her enemies. One of the defining features of Khutulun's early life was her close bond with her father, Kaidu. He relied heavily on her, not only as a warrior, but also as an advisor. While most women in the Mongol world were relegated to roles that involved domesticity or diplomacy, Khutulun was actively involved in the military and political decisions of her father's court. She was not merely a bystander or a symbol of noble birth. She was a valued member of Kaidu's inner circle, consulted on matters of war, governance, and strategy. In this regard, Khutulun's role within her family and the Chagatai Khanate was unprecedented. She represented the merging of power and intellect, a rare combination in a world where women's political roles were often constrained. Despite the immense respect she commanded among her family and allies, Khutulun's position was always tenuous. Her father's long-standing rivalry with Kublai Khan, which had already divided the Mongol Empire, meant that the Chagatai Khanate was constantly on the defensive. Kaidu's vision for the future of the empire was starkly different from Kublai's. While Kublai sought to consolidate power by uniting the Mongol world under his rule, Kaidu believed that such unity would diminish the unique strengths and freedoms of the various khanates. The bitter personal conflict between the two cousins had deep historical roots, stemming from their shared bloodline and differing interpretations of Mongol traditions. For Khutulun, this conflict was not just abstract politics, it was personal. The situation was further complicated by the role of Khutulun's marriage. In the Mongol world, marriage was often a political tool used to solidify alliances, secure loyalty, and maintain peace between rival factions. Khutulun, however, rejected this traditional path. She refused to marry, even though her father repeatedly tried to arrange a match for her. In one of the most famous stories surrounding her life, Khutulun reportedly declared that any man who wished to marry her would have to defeat her in a wrestling match. This challenge, a symbol of both her physical strength and defiance of conventional gender expectations, became legendary. No man was ever able to defeat her, and as a result, Khutulun remained unmarried throughout her life. This refusal to conform to societal expectations was a bold statement in a world where women's roles were strictly dictated by tradition. It reflected her desire to retain control over her own destiny, both in terms of her political future and her personal autonomy. Khutulun's reputation as a warrior and strategist continued to grow, and she played a critical role in her father's efforts to maintain the independence of the Chagatai Khanate. One of her most notable contributions was her participation in the wars against the Yuan dynasty. Kublai Khan's forces, with their superior numbers and resources, were a constant threat to Kaidu's kingdom. Khutulun's military genius was on full display as she helped lead several successful campaigns against Kublai's forces. Her ability to lead troops, engage in decisive battles, and plan successful strategies was a testament to her abilities as a military leader, and she became one of the most respected commanders in her father's army. Yet, despite her military victories, Khutulun's efforts could not prevent the eventual decline of her family's power. The political landscape of the Mongol world was ever-changing, and the once unstoppable force of the Mongol Empire was faltering. The Yuan dynasty, under Kublai Khan, was consolidating its power in China, and other khanates were either falling under the sway of the Yuan or engaging in their own internal struggles. Kaidu's resistance to Kublai, though admirable, was ultimately unsuccessful. As Kaidu's power waned, so too did Khutulun's influence. Though she fought valiantly to maintain her father's legacy, the Mongol Empire's splinter nature made it increasingly difficult for any one khanate to stand against the might of the Yuan dynasty. In the face of this growing political instability, Khutulun's role as a leader began to shift. While she had once been an active participant in military campaigns, her political influence began to wane as her father's power diminished. The Chagatai Khanate, once a formidable force in the Mongol world, began to fracture. Khutulun, despite her immense personal strength and capabilities, could not reverse the course of history. Her family's dynasty, like many others in the fractured Mongol Empire, eventually faded into obscurity. Yet, even in the face of this decline, Khutulun's legacy remains one of strength, defiance, and resilience. She is remembered as one of the few women in history who not only rose to power in a male-dominated society, but also thrived in the fiercely competitive world of Mongol politics. Her refusal to marry, her prowess as a warrior, and her strategic brilliance cemented her place in history as a woman who was not content to be a passive figurehead, but sought, instead, to carve her own path in a world dominated by men. In the end, Khutulun's story is not just one of personal triumphs and setbacks. It is a reflection of the complexities of power and the interplay of personal ambition, family loyalty, and political realities in the tumultuous world of the Mongols. It is the story of a woman who defied the conventions of her time and, in doing so, helped shape the history of an empire. Even as the Mongol world fractured and the influence of her family faded, Khutulun's name endured, a testament to her exceptional abilities and her unwavering determination to lead. As the years passed, Khutulun's life and legacy began to weave into the broader tapestry of Mongol history, not only through her individual achievements, but also through the challenges and transformations that marked her later years. Her fierce loyalty to her father, Kaidu, and her steadfast resistance against Kublai Khan's encroaching power had been the cornerstones of her early life. She had fought bravely on the front lines, commanded armies, and skillfully negotiated the complex landscape of Mongol politics. Yet, despite her unparalleled abilities, the world around her was changing, and the forces that shaped her destiny were beginning to shift in ways that would affect not only her fate, but the future of the Chagatai Khanate, and, in a broader sense, the Mongol Empire itself. Kaidu's struggles against Kublai Khan had been long and bitter, and as the conflict between the two cousins escalated, so did the stakes for Khutulun. Her role in her father's campaigns was not just one of military leadership, but also that of a symbol, one who embodied the fierce independence and rugged determination of the Chagatai Khanate. She was not simply a warrior. She was a beacon of the resistance to Kublai Khan's vision of a unified Mongol Empire under the rule of the Yuan dynasty. Khutulun's strength and leadership, her refusal to bow to tradition, and her insistence on maintaining control over her own fate made her a central figure in the ongoing power struggles that defined the Mongol world. Yet, as the years passed, the weight of those struggles began to take their toll. Kaidu's death in 1301 marked a turning point in Khutulun's life. His passing left a power vacuum in the Chagatai Khanate, and the already fragile alliance between the various Mongol factions began to unravel. The Khanate, once a formidable force, found itself beset on all sides. Internal divisions and external threats compounded the challenges facing the family, and Khutulun, despite her remarkable skills as a leader, was no longer able to stem the tide of decline. Her father's death left her in a difficult position. As a woman in a world dominated by men, her authority was always tenuous. While her military accomplishments and her leadership on the battlefield had earned her respect, the Mongol political system was still deeply patriarchal, and the expectations for women, even women as powerful as Khutulun, were rooted in traditional roles. Khutulun had risen to prominence in a time when the Mongol Empire was still defined by the warrior ethos of Genghis Khan. But that world was now fading. The Mongol Khanates were no longer as unified as they had been under the Great Conqueror, and the rise of powerful external forces, including the growing power of the Yuan dynasty in the east and the expanding Persian Empire in the west, threatened the very existence of the Chagatai Khanate. In the wake of her father's death, Khutulun's position became increasingly precarious. The leadership of the Chagatai Khanate was divided, and several factions within the court sought to capitalize on the instability. The once unified Mongol war machine had fractured into competing interests, and the delicate balance of power that Kaidu had maintained through a combination of military might and strategic alliances began to collapse. Khutulun, despite her formidable military skills and her deep knowledge of Mongol politics, was unable to prevent the fragmentation of the Khanate. Kublai Khan, meanwhile, continued to consolidate power in China. His Yuan dynasty, though facing its own challenges, was growing stronger, and its influence spread across Asia. The Yuan dynasty's dominance, coupled with the rise of other regional powers, made it increasingly difficult for the Chagatai Khanate to maintain its independence. As the external pressures mounted, Khutulun's role in the political and military affairs of her people became less pronounced. The once legendary warrior princess found herself increasingly sidelined as internal power struggles consumed the Chagatai court. Despite these challenges, Khutulun's legacy endured. Her refusal to marry, her legendary wrestling feats, and her unmatched prowess in battle had become the stuff of legend. She had carved out a reputation not just as a skilled warrior, but as a leader in a time when women were often relegated to the background. Khutulun had defied the conventions of her time, refusing to be bound by the traditional roles assigned to women in Mongol society. Her defiance, particularly her challenge that any suitor must defeat her in a wrestling match, had made her a symbol of strength and independence. No man had ever been able to defeat her, and her decision to remain unmarried throughout her life was a testament to her unwillingness to conform to the expectations of her gender. However, despite her personal strength and determination, Khutulun could not reverse the course of history. The Mongol Empire was no longer the monolithic force it had once been under Genghis Khan. The Chagatai Khanate, one of the empire's once proud divisions, was faltering. As her father's legacy waned, so too did the political influence of the family. The court of the Chagatai Khanate, once a powerful seat of Mongol authority, was consumed by factionalism and internal strife. Khutulun's influence, once so formidable, had begun to diminish as the Khanate weakened and external threats loomed larger. Despite her personal frustrations, Khutulun continued to stand as a symbol of Mongol strength. Her story was told and retold, passed down through the generations as a testament to the possibility of female leadership in a male-dominated world. She became a figure of myth and legend, her name synonymous with courage, strength, and defiance. Yet, the reality of her later years was marked by a growing sense of political impotence and personal isolation. The external forces that had once been her father's adversaries now seemed to engulf her family and their once powerful Khanate. The growing power of Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty marked the final chapter in the story of Khutulun's political relevance. Though she had been one of the most powerful women in the Mongol world, her ability to influence the direction of the empire was gradually eroded by the changing political and military landscape. Kublai's power was undeniable, and the Yuan dynasty's reach extended far beyond the borders of China, leaving the Chagatai Khanate increasingly isolated. In the end, Khutulun's story was not one of absolute victory or defeat, but of a relentless struggle against the forces of history and the complexities of power. She had fought fiercely to preserve her father's legacy, and she had carved out a unique space for herself in the annals of Mongol history. She was a warrior, a leader, and a symbol of strength in a world that often did not allow women to occupy such roles. Her refusal to be confined by societal expectations, her challenge to the traditional notions of gender, and her dedication to her people's survival and independence made her one of the most fascinating and enduring figures in Mongol history. As the Chagatai Khanate faded into the annals of time, Khutulun's legacy endured. Her story was not just one of personal triumphs and losses, but also a reflection of the broader forces at play in the Mongol world. It is a story that speaks to the enduring power of will, the importance of legacy, and the complexities of leadership in a rapidly changing world. Khutulun, in many ways, embodied the struggle for identity and power in a world defined by conquest, loyalty, and the shifting tides of history. Her life, though marked by challenges and eventual political decline, remains a powerful testament to the possibilities of leadership, even in the most tumultuous of times. Khutulun's life unfolded at a time when the Mongol Empire was at a crossroads. Once the most powerful and expansive empire in history, it had begun to fracture and splinter into various khanates, each with its own ambitions, struggles, and internal divisions. The unity that had been forged under the leadership of Genghis Khan was now a distant memory, and the descendants of the great conqueror found themselves embroiled in a complex web of rivalry, power struggles, and shifting alliances. In the midst of this turmoil, Khutulun stood out not only for her fierce warrior spirit, but also for the unique role she played in the political and military landscape of her time. Her early years were shaped by the intense conflict between her father, Kaidu, and Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan and the founder of the Yuan dynasty. The rivalry between Kaidu and Kublai was not just a matter of territorial ambition. It was deeply personal, rooted in the complex family dynamics and conflicting visions for the future of the Mongol world. Kaidu, ruler of the Chagatai Khanate, rejected Kublai's vision of a unified Mongol Empire under the banner of the Yuan dynasty. Instead, Kaidu believed in the autonomy of the various khanates and the preservation of the traditional Mongol way of life. This ideological conflict between the cousins set the stage for much of the political and military drama that Khutulun would navigate throughout her life. Khutulun, as the daughter of Kaidu, was raised in the heart of this conflict. She grew up not just as a noblewoman of the Mongol elite, but as an active participant in her father's efforts to resist Kublai Khan's dominance. From a young age, she was exposed to the harsh realities of war, and she was trained in the arts of combat, horseback riding, archery, and hand-to-hand fighting. While many women in the Mongol court were expected to fulfill traditional roles within the household or courtly affairs, Khutulun was encouraged by her father to embrace the warrior ethos that defined the Mongol nobility. She became a formidable fighter, known not only for her physical strength, but for her strategic mind. Khutulun's military abilities were not mere embellishments to her story. They were integral to the way she navigated her world. Her participation in her father's military campaigns was more than a symbolic gesture. She played an active role on the battlefield, commanding troops, leading cavalry charges, and even engaging in hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. Her skill as a wrestler became legendary, and it is said that no man was ever able to defeat her in a contest of strength. Her feats of physical prowess were matched only by her sharp intellect. Khutulun was not only a warrior, but also a skilled strategist. She understood the importance of maneuvering on the battlefield, using the terrain to her advantage and outwitting her opponents with her cunning tactics. Despite her talents, Khutulun's role in the broader political landscape was always limited by the gender norms of the Mongol world. While Mongol society valued strength and leadership, it was still predominantly patriarchal, and women, no matter how powerful, were often excluded from positions of formal authority. Khutulun's position as a woman in a male-dominated world meant that her influence, although significant, was often indirect. She was not the ruler of the Chagatai Khanate. That title was held by her father, Kaidu, and later her male relatives. However, Khutulun's influence within the Khanate was undeniable. She was a trusted advisor to her father, a warrior on the front lines, and a key figure in the political and military decision-making processes that defined the Chagatai Khanate's resistance to Kublai Khan. Her father's death in 1301 marked a turning point in Khutulun's life. Kaidu's passing left the Chagatai Khanate vulnerable to external threats and internal divisions. The political landscape of the Mongol world was shifting rapidly, and Khutulun found herself facing a new set of challenges. While she had once been an active participant in her father's military campaigns, she now had to navigate a fractured and unstable political environment. The Mongol Khanates, once united by blood and conquest, were now divided by competing ambitions and loyalties. The Chagatai Khanate, after Kaidu's death, struggled to maintain its power and influence. The various factions within the court vied for control, and Khutulun's role in the Khanate became less clear. Though she had been a leader in her own right, her position was now precarious. As a woman, she was excluded from the formal mechanisms of political power that were dominated by men. Her father had been a formidable leader, but without his presence, the Khanate was unable to resist the rising power of the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan. The Yuan dynasty, though facing its own internal challenges, was expanding its influence across Asia, and the Chagatai Khanate was increasingly isolated. Despite her personal frustration, Khutulun did not retreat from the struggle. She continued to advocate for her father's vision of an independent Chagatai Khanate and maintained a resistance to Kublai's authority. However, as the political and military situation grew more dire, Khutulun's ability to influence the course of events diminished. The Yuan dynasty was becoming more entrenched in its rule, and the various Mongol Khanates, including the Chagatai Khanate, were unable to mount a united front. The Khanates had grown weaker, divided by internal strife, and the Mongol Empire, once a unified force under Genghis Khan, was now a fragmented collection of competing entities. Khutulun's later years were marked by a sense of disillusionment and isolation. She had spent much of her life fighting for the survival and autonomy of the Chagatai Khanate, but the political realities of the time were such that her efforts seemed increasingly futile. The rise of the Yuan dynasty, coupled with the decline of the other Mongol Khanates, signaled the end of the era of Mongol dominance. Khutulun, despite her remarkable abilities and her unyielding determination, was no longer able to shape the destiny of the Mongol world. The forces of history, shaped by shifting alliances, military setbacks, and the relentless march of time, had moved beyond her. However, even in the face of these overwhelming challenges, Khutulun's legacy endured. Her life and her story became a symbol of resilience, strength, and defiance. She was not just a warrior princess, but a woman who defied the gender norms of her time and carved out a place for herself in the annals of history. Her refusal to conform to the traditional roles assigned to women, her legendary wrestling matches, and her contributions to her father's campaigns became part of the Mongol mythos. Khutulun's story was passed down through generations, inspiring countless others to challenge the expectations placed upon them and to embrace their own power and agency. Khutulun's influence, though waning in her later years, lived on in the legacy of her family and in the collective memory of the Mongol people. Her story was retold by historians and chroniclers, becoming an enduring testament to the possibilities of leadership in a world that often overlooked women's contributions. Her life was a testament to the power of individual agency and the potential for women to shape the course of history, even in the face of overwhelming odds. In the final analysis, Khutulun's life was one of paradoxes. She was both a fierce warrior and a symbol of resistance to the forces of change that were sweeping across the Mongol world. She was a woman who lived in a time when the world was rapidly evolving, yet she remained steadfast in her belief in the values of the past. Her efforts to uphold the legacy of her father and the Chagatai Khanate ultimately proved unsuccessful, but her personal courage and strength left an indelible mark on the history of the Mongol Empire. Khutulun's legacy endures as a symbol of the power of will, the importance of fighting for one's beliefs, and the strength to resist the forces of history that seek to define and limit one's place in the world. Khutulun's life, like the world she inhabited, was a constant negotiation between ambition and reality, tradition and innovation, power and limitation. Her story unfolded during a time when the Mongol Empire, once an unstoppable force that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, was undergoing profound transformation. While her great-grandfather, Genghis Khan, had unified the Mongol world with an iron will and vision for an empire that transcended borders, Khutulun's generation faced the disintegration of that unity. Her father, Kaidu, a prince of a Chagatai Khanate, resisted the growing dominance of Kublai Khan and his Yuan dynasty in China, leading to a bitter and long-standing rivalry that deeply impacted Khutulun's own destiny. The Mongol world was no longer the monolithic empire that Genghis Khan had forged. By the time of Khutulun's birth, the empire had fragmented into separate khanates, each with its own rulers, ambitions, and internal struggles. While some, like the Yuan dynasty, sought to build a lasting empire by consolidating Mongol power under a single ruler, others, such as the Chagatai Khanate, fiercely defended their autonomy. The power struggles between these khanates were not merely territorial. They were deeply personal, shaped by the bloodlines and rivalries that stretched back to Genghis Khan himself. Khutulun's father, Kaidu, had spent much of his life in a series of wars against Kublai Khan, seeking to prevent the consolidation of Mongol power under the Yuan dynasty and preserve the independence of the Chagatai Khanate. Khutulun grew up amidst these tensions. From a young age, she was exposed to the brutal realities of the world her father inhabited, one of constant warfare, shifting alliances, and political maneuvering. While her contemporaries in the Mongol aristocracy were expected to focus on managing households or arranging marriages for political gain, Khutulun's upbringing was radically different. She was trained to be a warrior, much like her father, who valued martial prowess and leadership above all else. She was taught to ride horses, use bows, and engage in hand-to-hand combat, excelling in the martial arts typically reserved for men. Her skills as a wrestler became legendary, and she earned the respect of her father's warriors, who saw in her the same fierce determination and strength that defined the greatest Mongol leaders. Yet, for all her military prowess, Khutulun's role in the world of Mongol politics was complicated by her gender. The Mongol Empire, despite its relatively progressive views on women's rights compared to many contemporary societies, was still dominated by male leadership. Although women in Mongol society could wield power, particularly within the family and court, it was rare for a woman to rise to the level of political or military leadership in the broader Mongol world. Khutulun was an anomaly, exceptional in every way, but still confined by the traditional gender roles of her time. She was not expected to inherit power in the same way a son might, nor was she considered a legitimate candidate to rule in the public sphere. Nevertheless, her ability to defy these expectations, to lead troops into battle and counsel her father on matters of state, set her apart from other women of her time and made her an extraordinary figure in Mongol history. Her role in the court and military campaigns of her father was crucial to the survival of the Chagatai Khanate. As Kaidu's trusted advisor and military leader, Khutulun was not simply a passive figure. She actively participated in the planning and execution of military strategies. The Mongol military was famous for its use of cavalry, speed, and shock tactics, and Khutulun, with her intimate understanding of the Mongol way of warfare, was instrumental in her father's efforts to maintain the independence of the Chagatai Khanate. She was not just a symbol of the Chagatai dynasty's resistance to Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty. She was an active force in that resistance. Despite her skills and her active role in the military, Khutulun's efforts could not prevent the inevitable decline of the Chagatai Khanate. The Mongol world, fractured into competing khanates, was no longer the unified force it had been under Genghis Khan. Kaidu's long war with Kublai Khan had left the Chagatai Khanate vulnerable to both internal dissent and external pressure. After Kaidu's death in 1301, Khutulun found herself in a precarious position. Her father's passing created a power vacuum, and the Khanate, divided by competing factions, began to fracture further. The strength of Kaidu's leadership, built on his military victories and ability to balance the ambitions of rival Mongol factions, had kept the Chagatai Khanate intact. Without him, however, the Khanate lacked the unity and direction it needed to survive the growing power of the Yuan dynasty. Khutulun's leadership, though significant, could not reverse the tide of history. Her efforts to maintain the independence of the Chagatai Khanate were thwarted by the overwhelming power of the Yuan dynasty, which continued to expand its influence in China and beyond. Kublai Khan's reign, while marked by internal challenges and uprisings, was a period of consolidation for the Yuan dynasty. In contrast, the Chagatai Khanate, like the other Mongol khanates, found itself increasingly isolated. Kublai's expansion into the heart of Asia, coupled with the internal fragmentation of the Chagatai Khanate, led to a gradual erosion of Khutulun's political power. The internal struggles within the Chagatai Khanate only compounded the difficulties Khutulun faced. The once unified Khanate was now splintered, and its rulers, once united by common bloodlines and ambitions, turned on each other in a desperate bid for power. Khutulun's position, despite her personal strength and abilities, became increasingly untenable. Her attempts to preserve the legacy of her father and defend the autonomy of the Chagatai Khanate were ultimately unsuccessful, as external and internal forces combined to weaken the Khanate. Despite the political decline of the Chagatai Khanate, Khutulun's personal legacy lived on. Her story, passed down through generations, became a symbol of the possibilities of leadership for women in a world that often excluded them from power. Her remarkable physical strength, her role as a military leader, and her defiance of traditional gender roles set her apart as one of the most extraordinary women in Mongol history. The stories of her wrestling matches, in which she defeated numerous suitors, and her unwavering loyalty to her father, became the stuff of legend. Khutulun, through her refusal to conform to societal expectations, carved out a space for herself in the annals of history, a space that was reserved for few women in the Mongol world. Khutulun's legacy, however, is not just one of individual triumphs. It is also a reflection of the complex dynamics of Mongol politics and the broader forces of history that shaped her life. Her story is intertwined with the fall of the Chagatai Khanate and the eventual dominance of the Yuan dynasty. The collapse of the Mongol Khanates after Genghis Khan's death was a result of not only external pressure, but also the internal fragmentation that followed his passing. The Mongol world, once a unified and formidable force, was now a collection of competing entities, each struggling to survive in a world that was rapidly changing. Khutulun's story also underscores the tensions between personal agency and the larger forces of history. Despite her remarkable abilities and her unwavering commitment to the independence of her family's Khanate, Khutulun's efforts were ultimately overshadowed by the larger political realities of the time. The rise of the Yuan dynasty, the decline of the Chagatai Khanate, and the shifting power dynamics in Central Asia meant that Khutulun's efforts, however heroic, could not change the course of history. Yet, her life is a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, individual agency can still leave a lasting mark on the world. In the end, Khutulun's life was one of paradoxes. She was both a figure of immense strength and resilience, and yet one who was ultimately unable to change the course of history. Her legacy is defined not just by the battles she fought and the victories she won, but by the way she defied the expectations of her time and carved out a place for herself in the historical record. Khutulun's story is a testament to the power of will, the importance of leadership, and the enduring strength of a woman who refused to be bound by the limitations imposed upon her. She may not have been able to save the Chagatai Khanate, but she saved her place in history, ensuring that her name would be remembered long after the Khanates of the Mongol Empire faded into the past. Khutulun's life, though marked by dramatic military engagements and unyielding resistance against powerful foes, was also deeply shaped by the broader cultural and political forces that defined the Mongol Empire's decline. As the world around her fractured and the unity that once defined the Mongol conquest of Eurasia faded, Khutulun found herself caught between two vastly different realities: the traditional Mongol way of life and the encroaching influence of the Yuan dynasty, a symbol of change, adaptation, and consolidation. Her story unfolds within the turbulent period following the death of Genghis Khan, a time when the Mongol world began to crumble under the weight of its own ambitions, internal divisions, and external pressures. Born into the Mongol elite, Khutulun was raised in the shadow of her father, Kaidu, a ruler of the Chagatai Khanate who rejected the authority of Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty. For much of her early life, Khutulun's world was shaped by her father's fierce opposition to Kublai's rule, and her loyalty to Kaidu's vision of Mongol independence was paramount. However, her exceptional skills as a warrior, her involvement in military campaigns, and her refusal to conform to the gender norms of her society set her apart from other women of the time and ultimately made her a central figure in the political and military struggles of the Mongol world. Khutulun was not just the daughter of a powerful leader, she was also a warrior in her own right. While women in the Mongol world could wield significant power within their own households and were often consulted in matters of diplomacy, Khutulun was a direct participant in the battles that would shape the fate of her family and her people. From a young age, she was trained in the arts of combat, learning to ride horses, shoot arrows, and engage in hand-to-hand combat. Her reputation as a formidable wrestler, unmatched by any of her male suitors, became legendary, and her presence on the battlefield was seen as a symbol of strength, courage, and resistance. Yet, as her father's primary ally and closest advisor, Khutulun was not just a physical presence on the battlefield. She was an integral part of the strategic decision-making that defined the Chagatai Khanate's military campaigns. The Mongol military was known for its remarkable mobility, precision, and speed, and Khutulun's deep understanding of these tactics made her an invaluable asset in her father's struggle against Kublai Khan's forces. Throughout her life, Khutulun's contributions to the Mongol war effort were marked by her ability to blend brute strength with tactical intelligence. She became a respected leader among her father's troops, and her courage and resolve in the face of danger became a source of inspiration for the warriors who fought alongside her. However, as the years passed, the political landscape of the Mongol Empire shifted, and Khutulun found herself increasingly isolated. The rivalry between Kaidu and Kublai Khan had been ongoing for decades, but after Kaidu's death in 1301, the Chagatai Khanate began to falter. The once strong resistance to Kublai's Yuan dynasty weakened, and Khutulun, despite her efforts, was unable to prevent the inevitable decline of her father's legacy. With the death of Kaidu, the political and military unity that had characterized the Chagatai Khanate began to unravel. The Khanate was divided, and the once formidable force that had challenged the Yuan dynasty was no longer capable of withstanding the rising power of Kublai Khan. Khutulun's position as a female leader within the Mongol military was always tenuous. Although her father had valued her as a trusted military advisor and leader, the traditional patriarchal nature of Mongol society meant that Khutulun could not step fully into the role of ruler after his death. As a woman, her authority was limited by the political and cultural realities of the time. While men were expected to rule the Mongol Khanates, women's roles, even those as prominent as Khutulun's, were often confined to the domestic sphere or the background of political decision-making. Although Khutulun's influence was significant, it was never absolute, and after her father's death, her role in the court and in military campaigns became increasingly diminished. Despite these limitations, Khutulun did not fade into obscurity. Her legacy, especially her refusal to marry, her unmatched strength, and her status as a warrior, became symbols of her defiance against the constraints placed on her by society. Khutulun's rejection of traditional gender norms was particularly significant in the context of Mongol society, where women were expected to marry and support their male relatives in their political and military endeavors. Khutulun's challenge to this expectation, symbolized by her famous wrestling contests in which she defeated all her suitors, became a defining feature of her life. Her refusal to marry was not merely a personal decision. It was a statement about her independence, her commitment to her family's legacy, and her unwillingness to be confined by societal norms. However, even as Khutulun continued to defy convention, the political realities of the time were unyielding. The Mongol Empire, once an overwhelming force that had reshaped the political map of Asia, was crumbling. The Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan had already consolidated power in China and was beginning to extend its reach into Central Asia. The other Mongol Khanates, including the Chagatai Khanate, were increasingly fragmented and vulnerable. The political and military challenges that Khutulun faced were not just external, they were internal as well. The Chagatai Khanate, after Kaidu's death, was consumed by internal rivalries, and the once powerful dynasty that had stood as a bulwark against the Yuan was now fractured. Khutulun's declining influence in the Chagatai Khanate mirrored the broader decline of Mongol power. The political fragmentation of the empire, coupled with the rise of other regional powers, such as the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Yuan dynasty in China, made it impossible for any one Khanate to maintain its power and independence for long. Khutulun, despite her military prowess and strategic genius, could not prevent the inevitable fall of the Chagatai Khanate. The Mongol world, once a unified force of conquest and expansion, had become a collection of isolated, competing Khanates, each struggling to survive in a changing world. As Khutulun's personal influence waned, the political situation in Central Asia and beyond continued to evolve. The Yuan dynasty, though facing its own internal challenges, had already begun to solidify its control over the region. The Chagatai Khanate, unable to withstand the combined pressure of internal divisions and external forces, gradually lost its power. Khutulun, who had once been a symbol of resistance against the Yuan, found herself in a world where her efforts were no longer enough to change the course of history. Her later years were likely marked by a sense of resignation and frustration, though her legacy would remain intact. She had played a pivotal role in the defense of her family's realm, and her life had become a symbol of strength, resilience, and independence for future generations. Khutulun's story became more than just the tale of a warrior princess. It became a testament to the potential of women in a world dominated by men. Her refusal to accept traditional limitations and her determination to remain true to her father's vision made her one of the most enduring figures in Mongol history. Even as the Chagatai Khanate faded from power, Khutulun's name lived on in the stories passed down through the generations. Her reputation as a fearless warrior and a leader of men survived long after her death, and her legend would inspire others to challenge the conventions of their time. The story of Khutulun is not simply one of military exploits and personal triumphs. It is a reflection of the larger forces that shaped the fate of the Mongol Empire. Her life is a reminder that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, the will to resist, the strength to defy, and the determination to fight for one's beliefs can leave a lasting imprint on history. Khutulun's legacy is a paradox, a life marked by both personal achievement and political defeat. She was a woman who rose to prominence in a world that had little place for women in positions of power, yet she defied the expectations of her society and carved out a space for herself in the annals of history. Her efforts to defend her family's heritage and her vision of a Mongol world free from the dominance of the Yuan dynasty ultimately could not withstand the tides of history. But her name remains a symbol of resilience, strength, and defiance, a reminder of what is possible when one refuses to be constrained by the limitations of their time. Khutulun's story, like the empire she was born into, exists within the tension of inevitable decline and lasting legacy. As the daughter of Kaidu, a leader of the Chagatai Khanate and one of the most formidable opponents to the rise of the Yuan dynasty, Khutulun's life was shaped by both extraordinary opportunity and insurmountable obstacles. Though she was born into a world of shifting allegiances and fracturing power, she was also born with a unique set of skills, a fierce determination, and a profound sense of loyalty to her family. These traits defined her life and established her as one of the most extraordinary women in the history of the Mongol world. As a child, Khutulun was raised amid the backdrop of her father's unrelenting struggle against Kublai Khan, the ruler of the Yuan dynasty. The Mongol Empire, which had once been united under the leadership of Genghis Khan, was now divided into several distinct khanates, each with its own rulers and interests. Kaidu, the ruler of the Chagatai Khanate, was determined to preserve the independence of his realm and resist Kublai's vision of a unified Mongol Empire. This ideological conflict, fueled by both political ambition and personal rivalry, formed the crucible in which Khutulun was forged. It was in this world of constant warfare and shifting alliances that she honed her martial skills and cultivated her remarkable leadership abilities. From an early age, Khutulun was not the kind of woman to be confined to the traditional roles of wife and mother, which were expected of women in many societies. The Mongols, however, had a more flexible view of gender roles, and Khutulun's father ensured that she was educated in the martial arts that had made the Mongols the feared warriors of their time. She learned to ride horses, shoot arrows, and fight in hand-to-hand combat. Her wrestling skills were legendary. It became known far and wide that no man could defeat her. She was an anomaly in a time when women's roles in society were often limited to the domestic sphere. Yet, Khutulun's presence in the military world was not an anomaly to her father. He respected her not just as his daughter, but as a fellow warrior, someone who could contribute meaningfully to the defense of their kingdom. As she matured, Khutulun's role in her father's campaigns grew ever more significant. She was not merely an observer of Mongol politics and warfare. She was an active participant. Her strategic mind and physical prowess made her an invaluable asset in the battle to defend the Chagatai Khanate. Khutulun's strength was not just physical, though her wrestling feats were legendary, but also intellectual. Her ability to read the battlefield and make tactical decisions earned her the respect of the soldiers who fought alongside her. In a world where men typically held leadership roles, Khutulun's leadership on the battlefield was a remarkable exception. Despite the constraints of her gender, she was a symbol of Mongol strength, a female warrior whose courage was as unmatched as her martial skills. Her involvement in the political struggles of her time was just as significant as her military exploits. The rivalry between her father and Kublai Khan was more than a personal conflict. It was a reflection of the broader political realities that shaped the future of the Mongol world. Kaidu's refusal to bow to Kublai's rule was an act of defiance that embodied the values of the Chagatai Khanate. Khutulun's loyalty to her father and her refusal to surrender to Kublai's expanding power were central to her identity. She understood that the fate of the Chagatai Khanate, and by extension, the fate of the Mongol world, hung in the balance. Her devotion to her family's cause was unwavering, and she would stop at nothing to defend the independence of her people. Yet, as the years passed, the world around Khutulun began to change in ways that she could not control. The Mongol Empire, once a singular force that stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, began to fracture. Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty, centered in China, gained strength, and the Chagatai Khanate, once a powerful kingdom, began to weaken. Kaidu's death in 1301 marked a significant turning point, not just for Khutulun personally, but for the entire Mongol world. With her father gone, the political unity that had characterized the Chagatai Khanate began to dissolve. Factions within the court vied for power, and the once formidable resistance to the Yuan dynasty grew increasingly disjointed. Despite Khutulun's remarkable leadership, the political landscape of the Mongol world had shifted beyond her control. Kublai Khan, despite his challenges, continued to consolidate power and extend the reach of the Yuan dynasty. The Chagatai Khanate, weakened by internal division and external pressure, could not withstand the combined forces of the Yuan and the growing influence of other regional powers. Khutulun, once a key player in her father's campaigns, found herself increasingly sidelined as the political realities of the time made it impossible for her to maintain the influence she had once wielded. In the aftermath of Kaidu's death, Khutulun's position within the Chagatai Khanate grew precarious. While she had enjoyed the respect of her father's court and military, her gender and her position as a woman in a patriarchal society meant that her role in the governance of the Khanate was limited. The Mongol system of governance, although it allowed for women to hold power in certain contexts, was deeply male-dominated, and Khutulun's ability to influence the course of events was always constrained by the fact that she was a woman. Though she had defied convention by participating in military campaigns and leading troops in a battle, she was ultimately unable to step fully into the role of ruler. The decline of the Chagatai Khanate mirrored the broader collapse of Mongol power. As the once unified Mongol Empire splintered into competing khanates, the ability of any one khanate to assert dominance over the others diminished. Khutulun's efforts to resist Kublai Khan's influence were ultimately unsuccessful. The Yuan dynasty, despite its internal challenges, continued to expand its influence across Asia, and the Chagatai Khanate, once a formidable force in its own right, faded into obscurity. For Khutulun, the later years of her life were likely marked by a growing sense of frustration and isolation. The world she had known, one in which she was a key military leader, an advisor to her father, and a symbol of Mongol strength, had changed beyond recognition. The internal divisions that had torn the Chagatai Khanate apart and the external pressures from the Yuan dynasty made it impossible for Khutulun to maintain the position she had once held. Despite her personal frustrations, she continued to remain loyal to her family's cause, though it became increasingly clear that the political tides were no longer in her favor. Despite the political decline of the Chagatai Khanate, Khutulun's legacy endured. Her remarkable feats as a warrior and her defiance of traditional gender roles became a lasting symbol of strength, independence, and resistance. Her story was passed down through generations, and her name became synonymous with the idea of women as leaders, warriors, and rulers in a world that often excluded them from such roles. Khutulun's life serves as a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the strength of will and the power of personal agency can leave a lasting imprint on history. In the end, Khutulun's story is not one of unbroken triumph or uninterrupted victory. It is a story marked by both personal achievement and political defeat, by moments of extraordinary success and times of deep disappointment. She was a woman who defied the expectations of her time, carved out a place for herself in the history of the Mongol Empire, and inspired future generations of women to challenge the limitations imposed upon them. While her efforts to preserve the independence of the Chagatai Khanate ultimately failed, her personal courage, strength, and resilience ensured that her name would not be forgotten.